So the German Schleifen plan to capture Paris and knock France out of the war by invading through Belgium ultimately failed, or as one student put it, the Germans used the Schleppen plan to surprise France by attacking through Bulgaria, which is not far from Paris. So obviously that student doesn't have a particularly strong grasp of geography. The early stages of the war were one of relative rapid movement. That is, German armies moving to invade France, British and French armies moving to challenge these German invasions. But quite quickly the war turns in a very different direction from what people had initially been expecting. What we actually start to happen is, as the German army retreats, both the French and British and the German armies try to outflank one another. So they basically both try and go to the north to surround the enemy. And both sides doing this, going further and further north, what is known as the race to the sea. Essentially, in the fall of 1914, both the Allied armies of the British and French and the Germans are trying to outflank one another to the north to try and surround one another. And in order to kind of hold the positions they already had, they began digging trenches. So what we start to get is a series of defensive trenches being dug as both armies try to outflank one another, and the end result is that by the end of 1914, essentially there's a giant wave of trenches, or a giant series of trenches stretching from the north, or from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. So both sides start digging trenches, and these are very, very extensive. The trenches can vary in terms of depth and how comfortable they were. Usually they were between 6 and 8 feet in depth. In certain parts, the trenches might have been as close together as only 50 yards apart. In other parts of the trenches, they could be up to a mile apart. And it kind of vary depending on location and geography. But essentially the war quickly bogs down. That what had been a war of movement quite quickly becomes a war of stalemate and defensive tactics. And this was something that people had not expected. I mean, when people talked about the war being over by Christmas, being over after a few months, they very much envisioned the Napoleonic age wars of, again, rapid troop movements, armies, sweeping across the continent. That is not what happened. In particular because we were at a technological moment where defensive capabilities were as provided by technology, outmatched anything that could be offered as an offensive weapon. So, for example, machine guns had been invented. They were obviously lethal in these trenches. The trenches were also protected by barbed wire. So basically all the advantages of warfare in 1914 were with the defenders. It was very, very difficult to mount any kind of sustained attack against barbed wire, against machine guns in 1914. The technology obviously eventually breaks through this. Eventually we get airplane warfare and tank warfare, which kind of negate the values of machine guns and barbed wire. But where military technology stood in 1914 meant that there was an enormous advantage to the defenders. That being said, most of the commanders on both sides were committed to winning the war, which meant attacking the enemy position. So what we get, especially in 1914, 15, 1916, are regular efforts to try and defeat the enemy by advancing across what was known as no man's land. That was the area between the trenches, in order to attack the enemy trench. It was called no man's land basically because you basically did not want to get caught out there, because when you were faced against heavily armed machine gun positions, you were essentially sitting ducks. And this led to massive slaughter. And I'll talk a little more in this lecture later on about some of the slaughter that was inflicted. But yeah, these are essentially offensive-minded generals on both the Allied and the German side who failed to deal with the reality of the defensive war that technology had made inevitable. So we get oftentimes quite senseless slaughters. And of course the thing is, even if you achieved your objective of reaching the enemy trench, there was usually support trenches behind that. So it wasn't the case. It was actually very difficult to break through, because even if you captured the main trench, there was defensive positions behind those trenches that meant that it was very difficult to go much further. So we often get these campaigns where enormous losses of life take place, but with very little territorial change. And this essentially marks the pattern of the war up until the last months of 1918. That the war on the Western Front, and I'll say more on the Eastern Front later on, but the war on the Western Front is primarily fought as a defensive struggle in these trenches with the Germans on one side and the British and French on the other. Now I want to show you a couple of videos to talk about, just to give you some kind of idea of life in the trenches. One refers to what the main video is going to talk about what's called the Christmas Truce, a very famous incident in Christmas 1914, where soldiers on both sides kind of pause fighting for a day and share in a moment of peace. And then the second video is just to give you some idea of the physical and psychological impact of fighting in the war. So these two videos will be back to back. Well, before that, I just want to give you this student musing. So military technology progressed with ideas such as guns that would shoot straight. At war, people get killed and then they aren't people anymore, but friends. After fighting in the trenches, the soldiers became close, no matter what their social standards. Men on both sides would have gotten to know each other much better if they didn't have to wear uniforms. When peace broke out, the men excitedly relieved themselves wherever they were. Okay, so with that thought, let's see, look at these couple of videos here.
Franz. Live and let live did not save the life of Franz Blumenfeld. He was killed 11 days before Christmas. One of a million soldiers who died on the Western Front in 1914. On Christmas Eve, 1914, temperatures dropped below freezing on the Western Front. In some places, it began snowing, obscuring the moon. Then all across the German lines, lights began to appear. At first, the British thought the Germans were preparing to attack. But instead of rifle fire, sounds of singing drifted across no man's land.
The Germans would be heard singing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The British would respond with a British Christmas carol. In some places, food was lobbed over into the opposing trenches. In one or two instances, the Germans erected Christmas trees. And there was a kind of mutual curiosity, certainly instances of soldiers applauding each other's singing.
The curiosity led to something never again repeated on the battlefield.
In one or two places on Christmas Day itself, the first curious, slightly headstrong people, perhaps from both sides, poked their head above the trenches and, being made aware that somebody over the other side wasn't going to shoot it off, then clambered cautiously out.
One of the first to take part was Captain Charles Stockwell.
I ran out into the trench and found that the Saxons were shouting, "Don't shoot! We don't want to fight today. We will send you some beer." A German officer appeared and walked out into the middle of no man's land. So I moved out to meet him amidst the cheers of both sides. We met and formally saluted. He introduced himself as Count something or other and seemed a very decent fellow.
By now, these soldiers knew that the war was going to last a long time, and that many of them would not survive. The unofficial truce was a chance to bury the dead. At one funeral in no man's land, soldiers from both sides gathered to honor the fallen by reading the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
The Christmas truce was the last twitch of the 19th century. By that, I mean it was the last public moment in which it was assumed that people were nice. It was the last gesture that human beings are getting better the longer the human race goes on.
December the 26th. At 8:30, I fired 3 shots in the air and put up a flag with Merry Christmas on it. The Germans put up a sheet with "Thank you" on it. And the German captain appeared on the parapet. We both bowed and saluted. He fired 2 shots in the air. And the war was on again.